As he had promised, James waited outside and out of sight, as Shida was allowed into the place where her con-specific terrorists were being detained. However, what she hadn't quite expected was that she nearly walked right into someone's back the moment she stepped through the open door. Stopping herself quickly, she caught the very tail end of an exasperated sigh escaping the person standing so obstructively in the middle of the hallway between the different detention cells, right before their ears twitched. Obviously, they must have heard the door opening to let her inside already. However, they now seemed to react to her actual presence separately. Turning around with vigor in their movements, the Miat quickly scanned Shida up and down with almost copper-coloured eyes that were quite the match for their tan skin. With a complexion similar to Shida, one side of the feline's head was shaved, while the slightly darker hair on the other was thrown over it in a side-cut-like style. Their face was a bit on the rounder side, especially by Mia standards. However, that didn't detract one bit from the fact that they could quite visibly more than keep up with Shida in the physical department, as some parts of their beige-brownish uniform were a little tight around the arms, and shoulders specifically, indicating they had put on a good part of that mass only recently. "Ah, it's our runaway," they finally stated, after a few moments of scrutinizing scanning over Shida's form, and their arms quickly crossed into a relaxed position. "Welcome to my ship, Lieutenant Commander. My Minteha Jai is a beauty, isn't she?" For a moment, Shida caught herself almost wondering why her host, who she realized had to be the local commander by now, was crossing her arms instead of going for a handshake, nearly assigning some sort of malice to the action, before she quickly realized that she had spent way too much time around humans at this point. Scoffing a bit at herself, she tried to remind herself of the culture she had grown up in for more than half her life, as she brought her hands behind her back in a more respectful Miat salute. "Lieutenant Commander Shida, at your service," she greeted in an evenly paced, respectful manner. "It is a pleasure, Commander Jireynora." "The pleasure is all mine," the commander replied with an honest-seeming smile. For a moment, she stretched a bit to look past the slightly taller Shida in order to check if the door behind her was well and truly closed. Once she had seen what she wanted, she leaned in a bit and held one hand next to her mouth in a shielding manner as she whispered, "Just between the two of us, any friend of my mom is a friend of mine, and you did her a huge service, so I really owe you." Shida raised an eyebrow and tilted her head slightly as the words sunk in for her. Friends with the commander's mother? And why was she so weirdly secretive about it? Did they know anyone who could be... Her questioning thought was interrupted by a light bulb going off in her head, as the answer to her question crashed right into her train of thought. Shida's eyes widened as she looked back at the commander once she had leaned away again. She was one of her Veselons. She had to be. That was the only way this made any sense. "No way," she quietly mouthed to herself, which Jireynora apparently understood, as she widely smiled to herself. She nodded briefly before taking up a slightly more formal position again, quickly pretending like the brief exchange had never happened. "So, you're here to take a crack at these dry bones?" Jireynora then stated, returning to her conversational volume before gesturing behind herself at the detention cells. It was almost a bit hard to believe that there were actually people locked up in those. It was so eerily quiet as the rooms were locked tight, not letting any sounds from the inside escape unless they were told to do so. "You are free to, but I mean no offense when I say that I would be surprised if you managed to get any more out of them than I wrote into my reports." As she spoke, her tail swung in an almost challenging manner, though Shida believed her when she said that she had no intention of insulting her. It seemed like the commander simply had a bit of a competitive streak by nature. "Wouldn't be the first time I surprised someone," she therefore gave back in good-natured confidence that wasn't entirely accurate to reality. After all this was only meant to be an honest attempt, and she really had no idea she was even going to achieve anything here. But what else was she going to do if she didn't try? It wasn't like there was a whole lot else she could accomplish right this moment. "Any tips on where to start?" she then added, as she looked along the rows of cells, figuring she may as well ask to possibly save herself some time. Jireynora nodded, and briefly ran a hand along the longer side of her hair to push it back a bit, before she turned on the spot, and waited for Shida to follow along with her, as she led her fellow feline down the hallway. As was typical for anything built by their people, the walls, floors, ceilings, and even doors were all of a dark colour, and fluidly followed into each other in their rounded shapes, leaving no sharp edges or corners between them, and almost evoking the feeling of a naturally emerged, if far more orderly than usual, cave. After they had passed 3 of the pairs of doors spanning the hallway on both sides, Jireynora stopped in front of the 4th on the right, and lifted a hand to flatly pat against it. "These will be the ones who almost got turned into sieves," she announced, with a tone that sounded a bit too casually happy, while expressing something so possibly disturbing. "One of them happens to be their leader." That part Shida already knew, but she simply assumed that the commander merely wanted to be thorough. "Got it," she quickly said with a thankful nod, before stepping slightly to the side to allow for the commander to more easily pass her on the way out. Taking the hint, Jireynora began to walk towards the exit with a sway in her steps, patting Shida on the shoulder once as she moved along, which was already far more casual contact than mere strangers would usually expect to have with one another. However, being used to the human way to conduct oneself by now, Shida neither minded nor even really noticed that much. "Holler if anything comes up," Jireynora then quickly informed her, as one last formality, before speeding her steps up a bit, reaching the door quite quickly and exiting the ship's detention area. She didn't look after her, but she waited until she heard the sound of the door opening and closing before moving to the control panel of the cell's door. Placing her hand on it, it immediately informed her that she didn't have the necessary clearances to open the cell, yet she could change it into visitation mode if she desired. Admittedly, despite her origin and upbringing lying squarely with her species, Shida never had all too close of contact with their own military tech, since she skipped right to the communal forces once she was old enough. Therefore, she was a bit surprised that the machine was programmed to immediately assume she probably wanted to open the cell, instead of giving her some sort of options first. However, she didn't let that stop her, as visitation mode sounded pretty much exactly like what she needed. She only briefly paused, quickly checking the camera on her chest to make sure it was actually running, as she didn't want to cause a repeat of recent hiccups on accident. Seeing as everything was working as intended, she then informed the control panel that she accepted the proposal, which in turn caused the door to open, though it would have been more fitting to say that an outer, metal layer of it peeled away, leaving an intact but much more transparent second layer that was presumably made of either tempered glass or transparent metal behind. Additionally to being see-through, this transparent layer hosted the additional feature of being noticeably perforated with little minuscule holes all over. As soon as the noise of the outer layer peeling away had stopped, these perforations allowed sound from inside the cell to reach Shida's ears, as the people inside seemed to react with both surprise and mild annoyance to the sudden disturbance of their peaceful confinement. One of them, a familiar dark-skinned man with a scar right over his cheekbone, which he had sustained from a cut Andrich gave him during their scuffle back onto Santiot Station, at least if Shida recalled correctly, seemed to have sat on the ground and leaned against the wall before her arrival, and was now in the process of pushing up to its feet. Meanwhile, the cell's second occupant was laying on one of the beds and slowly lifted his head to look at her. It shook heavily as he did so, almost seeming like he barely had the strength to hold it up. However, a moment later, his hand had reached for a device hanging from his hip, which was connected to a sort of headband he wore through some cables, and soon enough the shaking of his head lessened more and more, before finally ceasing entirely. Shida recognized his face. She remembered the way they had wrestled for control back onto Santiot themselves, how he had grabbed her, how she had turned the tables on him, how he had clawed onto her face in a desperate yet failed attempt to regain control, and how he had ultimately paid an unnecessary price for it. Eskvatara and Mirakshra. She simultaneously stated their names and greeted them, as she bowed her head ever so slightly in a sign of recognition. Her gaze then focused on Mirakshra specifically. "I hear that your wounds are healing well." She felt slightly awkward and a bit rusty for a moment as the words left her lips, since she hadn't spoken in Siamwit in quite a while. Mirakshra had a rather placid expression on his face, as he moved his head in a confirming manner. Meanwhile, Eswatara's briefly flashed with a rather raging mien that stood in stark contrast to that of his compatriot. However, just as quickly as it had appeared, it also vanished again as he tore his eyes away from her, changing his expression to one of clear self-reprimand with a clack of his lips. He began to say, sounding quiet and hesitant at first, before once again clicking his lips and gritting his teeth slightly, as he quite obviously forced himself to speak the hell up. I hope the same is true for Alwyn's sister, he brought out deliberately, lifting his gaze to meet Shida's once again. Then, a moment later, he also added with a bit more hesitation, and also, everyone else who was harmed in the fire. Shida was surprised. Despite almost sounding like it was said with reluctance, she couldn't help but feel that the well-wishes were nothing but honest, mostly because she found his behaviour of quite obviously fighting against the anger that was so clearly bubbling inside him to express some eerily familiar and relatable. Nia has woken up and is on the best way to recovery, she therefore confirmed for him, entirely truthfully, seeing no reason to meet what was clearly his best attempt at peacefulness with any denial or hostility. She would very much take this honest but rough attempt over any sugary sweet lies. Instead of Eswatara, it was Maraksha who reacted the most to that information, his body deflating slightly, in a clearly relieved exhale that also caused his ears to hang for a moment. I'm glad, the man said, and placed a hand on his chest, seeming like that information had taken a big weight off him. A moment later, he opened his eyes again to look right at Shida, his previously placid expression now turning more coy, as his lips lifted into a sheepish grimace. Though I guess I should be quicker to apologize to you than to her. Shida's hand inadvertently lifted to the side of her face, running along the scars that still decorated it, all the way from her temple to her jawline, with the soft pads on her fingertips. I think you've more than gotten your comeuppance for it at this point, she replied. There was a part of her that was the tiniest bit angry about the scars, but compared to the anger she was used to at this point, that was nothing. And comparing those few scars against the damage she now knew he had taken in return, and additionally being shot, was something that allowed her to leave it at that. Who wasn't quite as able to do that, however, was Eswatara, as his face once again flashed in deep anger. Of course, James had given her the rundown of his own interaction with the two of them, as well as his general impression of who exactly they were as people, at least as far as he could tell, and so Shida was kind of ready for that reaction. Thus, as he still inhaled to give his presumably cutting comment about what he thought about her labelling Maraksha's condition as comeuppance, she managed to take the wind out of his sails before he had a chance to get it out. I'm also sorry for the way things happened, she said, having already prepared her approach to this topic beforehand. Everything happened quite quickly. If I could turn back time, I would like to prevent things from escalating to the degree that they did. And even if it's probably of very little comfort to you, I don't think James wanted to harm you this badly. I'm not going to pretend like he cared at the time, but it certainly wasn't his intention. Maraksha confirmed with a movement of his head yet again, while Eswatara seemed to be stuck between wanting to still get his scathing comment out and wanting to listen to the exchange. The latter of which won out in the end, as his stance relaxed a bit and his ears folded back slightly. I don't know if I would care how badly I hurt someone either, if I saw my girlfriend get scratched up before my eyes, especially during an armed ambush. Maraksha was quick to admit, and his words caused Eswatara to avert his gaze toward one of the cell's rounded corners for a moment. We were just doing our job, he gruffly mumbled under his breath, which Shida's fine ears still easily picked up. And we were doing ours, she replied after nodding at his words, acknowledging the truth behind it. Whether it was the right or wrong thing that they had followed their orders was not something she was interested in discussing right that moment. That would be for judges to decide. What mattered to her right now was just to not have these men shut down on her. Though there was at least a tiny twinge of sympathy on her side, given that it was quite possible that they thought the world might literally end if they allowed James to just walk away, assuming they had known why exactly the order had been given. It was just A really shitty situation overall.
You can say that again,
Maraksha agreed, and briefly lifted his hand to the device on his head, caressing it much like Shida did with her scars earlier. A brief moment of awkward silence followed after that, as all three felines stood there, and quietly allowed that statement to sit, while their tails slightly swayed from the mild tension that remained in the room. Ultimately, it was Esfatara who broke it, as he turned his head to look directly at Shida, his eyes narrowing a bit in mild, curious suspicion.
You aren't going to bring up that we tried to kill him?
He wondered, seemingly having expected the conversation to lean much more on that directly malicious part of their interactions, which was far less excusable than their first encounter. Shida exhaled harshly through her nose, and shook her head in a way that made her hair rustle. James gave your friend a permanent disability, and you were also framed for an attack on an ambassador, forcing you to leave your home and go into hiding. You hated him for that and wanted to get revenge, no matter what. And apparently your team was loyal enough to go along with that, she surmised, based on what she had gleaned from all the things she had heard about the situation. What do you want me to say about it? That it was bad? I mean, obviously. I don't think a would-be assassin needs any lectures on morality from me. I'm not going to stand here and fucking argue with you whether you were right to try and kill my boyfriend. But that is that, and this is this. And this is about what you and I can do right now. We exchanged apologies. That's a start. Esfatara glowered a bit at those words.
I did not apologize to...
He tried to insist, but Shida cut him off again. And he wouldn't ask you to, she stated firmly with her hand raised, to indicate that she understood what he wanted to say. You apologized to Nia, the others, and me. That's enough for him. For the time being. He'll still want you to be punished, but that's for later. He does not care one bit if you are sorry for attacking him. I kinda hate that he's like that, but it is what it is. She deliberately kept quiet about the part where she very much cared that this asshole refused to apologize to James. Of course, an apology meant very little when you tried to fucking kill someone, but damn it! It would have been a start, and she would have loved nothing more to make him apologize. However, pressing that issue wouldn't have gotten her anywhere right now. It would have only dragged the discussion on and possibly caused him to shut down entirely, and so she held herself back and allowed the topic to drop. Esfatara deflated a bit as he released some of the air that was left in his lungs from his interrupted sentence. Well, he then grumbled, with what air he had still left as his ears once again drooped. I guess it is fair that he didn't want anyone else pulled into this. He sounded about as enthusiastic about admitting that as he would have been about gargling with nails, yet, once again, that only served to increase the genuineness of the statement. Considering you threw yourself in front of his gun to protect us, I am willing to believe that you're not entirely against us. Maraksha now chimed in. Then he exhaled deeply and added, In all honesty, I'm just glad it's finally over. Even if we'll get locked away for the rest of our lives, I prefer it at this point. This life on the run. He paused and shook his head for a moment to vent some of his displeasure. I'm not going to pretend like I went to the military for some super noble reason, but that doesn't mean I wasn't just a little bit proud of being a protector. All this hiding and plotting and scheming is worse than the tremors. He turned his gaze to look at Esfatara, who seemed not quite able to make eye contact with his friend at that moment. It's the end of the line, he agreed, even though he didn't look at Maraksha. He seemed defeated, and not only because he had lost this cat-and-mouse game. Shida simply allowed that to sit. I'm going to apologize in James's name for something he would never apologize for, she then stated after a long moment, bringing her attention back to Maraksha. What happened to you? It can never be undone. James told me of the fight you had over that topic, and I would like to apologize in his name for something I can understand, but he likely never will. I understand how insulting it is to you that he suggests to reverse the damage through unnatural means. I thought like that not too long ago as well, so I know exactly the feelings it causes within you. The horror, the deep discomfort. I don't agree with it anymore, but I understand it because I lived it. James just can't, for many reasons. However, he would agree with me that it is your body, and it should be your decision how you want it to be treated. He just probably won't ever be able to express that to you specifically. The idea that this damage he caused could be fixed with what is so easy in his eyes hurts him more than he could admit to you. It's not really an excuse, but I think it's something you should know. Maraksha nodded for a moment before scoffing in a half-laugh.
Maybe that is his comeuppance then,
he stated lightheartedly, presumably trying to lighten the mood. After a much briefer moment of silence, Eskvatara once again was the first to break it, as he veered the conversation back onto his previous course.
So, you're here to discuss what we can do in the now, you said, he reminded her,
as his ears twitched upwards, turning to her and opening widely, showing that he was truly listening now.
What would that be? We already told our last interrogators most of the relevant parts. What else do you want out of us?
Shida crossed her arms briefly, only to then lift one of them while supporting its elbow on the wrist of the other, lazily gesturing with the thus freed up hand. I don't know if you were told already, but we suspect that the people who attacked the facility we were all held in didn't know that you were being transported off-planet, she explained, and her own tail swayed in a bit of a wider arch as she spoke. These people, they killed and tried to kill both allies and random witnesses before. Soldiers, civilians, and politicians alike. They've nearly driven one of their own who got a little too trigger-happy into madness. They very clearly do not like leaving loose ends, and they do not care if those people are planning to talk or not. If you keep your mouth shut about anything that has to do with them, you're only giving them what they want, and they don't give a monkey's shit about you in return. Did Shida expect this to be anything those guys didn't know, or at least hadn't been told already? No, of course not. But now it was time to see if her strategy of getting these guys to not shut down would pay off. They had nothing to lose here, and they knew that. However, from very personal experience, Shida knew that that could mean little if spite was in play. Now it was all about if she had gotten them to at least neutrally like her. Eskvatara scoffed and shook his head slightly.
No need to state the obvious, he grumbled slightly,
while Maraksha shifted a bit uncomfortably on his bed.
We really already provided all the information we were asked for.
He reinforced the earlier statement.
We will gladly repeat that under oath if that is what you want from us.
Shida exhaled slowly. Well, that was a start at least. That hopefully showed that they were being honest with their earlier testimonies. But still, she wanted to try and push a bit further, just to be sure she hadn't entirely wasted her time here, even if she knew that would have been a possibility from the start. Anything could be useful. Is there anything you didn't mention? Maybe nobody ever asked about it and you felt like it was too minor to bring up, or you weren't sure what it meant. Anything like that? She mildly insisted, obviously not wanting to seem too brash and accidentally reignite any remaining spite. Her two fellow felines were quiet for a moment again, and briefly looked at each other, exchanging a long glance that was seemingly mostly meant to bridge some time while they thought.
Nothing,
Maraksha then ultimately stated with a shake of his head. Shida grimaced slightly, the reality sinking in that this probably hadn't been anything useful from her side. Despite knowing that was a possibility from the start, that didn't mean it didn't sting at least a little.
There's one thing.
Eskvatara's voice suddenly pulled her out of her brief moment of self-pity, and she looked at him with the most candid expression she could muster, since he sounded a bit hesitant, as he recalled something he hadn't mentioned so far.
I only got a brief glimpse at it, and I've no idea if it means anything, but... Well, I already told the commander about that supercomputer that I stole a glance at once or twice. I assume that's how they hacked into your communications and stuff. But,
He paused for a moment and stroked some hair out of his face, as he seemingly wondered how to properly phrase what he wanted to get across here.
What I didn't mention so far is that the thing looked pretty wrecked. Like, it was a mess of wires and circuits that were randomly welded to a framework that looked like it was meant to just barely give it any form of structure. It was huge, don't get me wrong, but it looked more like junk than super advanced tech. I just assumed that it still had to be because of the results. but they kept it in a freezer because it couldn't cool itself, so I can't believe it was built by some chaotic genius." He sighed a bit and shrugged to finalize his testimony. "No idea if that is at all relevant, but if there's any chance it'll help get those nape-biting bastards, I'll take it," he then grumbled. Shida's ears twitched slightly as she allowed that to sink in. A heap of junk was what had broken through the humans and Quavery's cyber defenses, and impersonated to realize so convincingly it gave a conspiratorial councilman enough of a scare to turn himself in. In the end, it was probably down to the skill of the hacker behind the machine for sure, but with all the resources they could bring up, they wouldn't opt for faulty and impractical hardware for no reason. However, she couldn't really think of one. But still, that didn't have to mean it wasn't important. Just that she might have not been the right person to tell exactly why it was important. But there were people around who knew a lot more about computers and cyber warfare than she did, and just maybe, this little piece of information would mean a huge revelation for them. And that possibility alone already made it worth it to her that she had swallowed her pride for this interaction. "Thank you," Shida said, her thanks being genuine despite the surrounding circumstances. "Farewell," she then added, as she moved her hand back to the control panel. "I hope you guys find some sort of peace with your situation." Of course, Shida immediately reported what she had learned dutifully, kicking off the necessary procedures for it to be processed and passed on to the best minds the UHSDF and Reason had to offer. However, said procedures would obviously not happen instantly, and so it would be a while until any sort of conclusion would get back to them from that front. Considering that, she had also quickly gathered the local team, figuring that they may as well put their own brainpower together in an attempt to form some preliminary ideas of their own, with which they could maybe at least try to form some sort of plans of action. Because if there was one thing that they all agreed on at this point, then that their plan to be more proactive instead of reactive needed to be kicked into a much higher gear. The entire team had come together in one of the gardens on the outer levels of the sun, occupying it almost entirely for themselves as they spread out around it, all going for different methods to hopefully spur their brain into better thinking. James sat on the cornerstone of one of the small vegetable patches, hunched into a thinking ball with the foot of one of his legs shoved onto the crook of the other, and his elbow leaning onto his thigh, while the corresponding hand covered his face, his fingers gently stroking through the stubble on his chin and cheek. Shida and Coco had both taken their places next to him on either side. Shida sat straight, with her tail swishing through the leaves of the plants behind her, one fang chewing on her lip as her brain worked. Coco, meanwhile, had her eyes closed and arms crossed, with one leg nervously bouncing in place. Sam passed them by as she was walking in endless circles around the vegetable patches, seemingly needing to keep her blood pumping, while constantly staring at the ceiling, her long ponytail gently bobbing behind her as it hung loosely from her tilted head. Andrej had opted to go for an even more ridiculous boss than James's curled ball, as he hooked his legs over the high backrest of one of the benches provided in the garden, and hung the rest of his body down from it, hanging upside down while his long hair pulled on the ground under him, while his scarlet eyes stared straight ahead, whenever they didn't briefly follow Sam every time she walked by. Conglorch had found a place for himself that allowed him to lie almost right under one of the strong UV lamps, providing energy for the plants, seemingly enjoying the feeling of the rays hitting his plates, or he thought with a relaxed expression on his face. Moore sat right next to him, seeming slightly shaky, yet also very determined as she pondered with a very serious expression on her face, while one of her claws rhythmically tapped her arm. That only left Admir and Tuya, who had taken a page out of Sam's book and would keep themselves physically active, though instead of walking in circles, they had opted for some slightly more engaging activity, as they were throwing a mid-sized rubber ball against a close-by wall, allowing it to bounce back and be caught by the other, which was made significantly more difficult by the influence that the ship's gravitational spin had on the ball's trajectory, thus keeping them on their toes. Though, among the two of them, Admir held the additional characteristic that he apparently felt the need to think aloud on occasions. "One thing is for sure," he said, as he firmly tossed the ball against the wall, causing it to bounce back with a dull thud, while Tuya dashed in the direction it would be flying. Shida was right. There was no way they would be using that thing if it wasn't better than anything else they could get their hands on in some way, shape or form. And it's not practicality, nor ease of use, so it basically has to be effectiveness, or at least some facet of it. Tuya caught the ball and threw it back to the wall. Since she was already engaged with Admir, she was generally the one who felt a call to answer him whenever he gave voice to one of his ideas. If it can't call itself, it must either be broken or was built to stand in a cooled environment, she confirmed, going down the route of trying to find its purpose through the observable features they knew of. If it's as much of a junk pal as that asshole said, then the idea that it's broken is of course the more obvious one. But if it's really that huge, I am almost more willing to believe it was simply meant for a cool environment. Trying to cool down such huge computers internally is generally a huge pain. But the question is, why the hell would it look so busted then? Why would it be so busted up anyways? Admir replied, catching the ball just barely, as he avoided landing on his face from his mad dash by doing a cartwheel over his right hand. Shouldn't they have repaired it more sensibly than welding random parts to a framework in any case? Or, made or brought a new one? It has to be unique in some way, Sam said, with both hands on her temples, engaging in the conversation while she was walking by closely enough to do so. It just has to. Otherwise, nobody would go through that effort. And I so hope it's not just some emotional attachment. Admir tilted his head a bit in acknowledgement, almost as if he hadn't considered that angle. Some crazy-skilled hacker's favourite? He said in consideration, before tossing the ball again. Maybe. Still doesn't explain the botched job repair, though. How many unique computers are there? James then asked in a half exclamation, and briefly gestured with the hand that had covered his mouth so far. He self-admittedly knew very little about computers, but from what he understood, those things were generally made in models. More than you might think, Tuya, however, quickly informed him. A lot of firms and companies have their own unique setups. Maybe it's something one of those threw in the trash. Her hands closed around the ball right as she finished talking, immediately tossing it once again. They would either recycle or destroy it more thoroughly. None of this in-between nonsense, Admir said self-assuredly, and easily caught the ball as it came right at him that time. Unless they didn't have the possibility to. Andrzej now also joined in, still hanging upside down as his eyes moved from one person to another. Long shot, but maybe they salvaged this from some war zone. But why not repair it properly? Tuya said, that point seemingly weighing heavily on her mind. I can think of no reason just welding it in place, as it would be better than properly putting it together. It can't just be laziness, can it? It can, Coco replied to that, her legs still heavily bouncing. She didn't open her eyes as she spoke, but her expression scrunched up even more. But do we really want to rely on that? I don't. Me neither, Shida confirmed, her ears twitching and tail swaying swiftly. It may just have been her pride misplacing her energy to keep itself intact since she got the info. However, the more she thought about it, the more she felt that this detail must have been important. She just couldn't think of why for the life of her. But still, we're overlooking something. I'm sure of it.